Hey everyone, how's it going? I have a mild cold and feel pretty stuffed up, but today we're going to be talking about aviation lineages, and specifically the more direct lineages, where the successor design is directly influenced by, or even is a derivative of the previous one. For an example of an indirect lineage, take something like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Two planes that are technically related, as the P-47 was also used quite a lot as an early close air support aircraft, and the Thunderbolt II is named after the P-47, but realistically speaking, the A-10 is more akin to a spiritual successor, technically related in some sense, but quite different. But for direct lineages, we have a boatload of examples to choose from the P-51's lineage in the A-36, the F-82, and the PA-48, to the BF-109's lineage going up to the ME-609, to the failed lineage of the P-38 and the XP-49 and XP-58. If we went through every single aviation lineage in history, then this video would be hours and hours and hours long. So instead of doing that, I instead want to focus on one specific one, a small lineage of 3 planes that really aren't that glamorous. Planes that don't really have the historical glory or street cred that others do, but nevertheless ended up being quite prominent and important pieces of Britain's aerial forces in the Second World War. Our main focus for today will be just one of these 3 planes, specifically the last in the lineage, but we will talk about all 3 of them. This is the Bristol Beaufighter, along with its father, the Bristol Beaufort, and its grandfather, the Bristol Blenheim. The story of these 3 planes begins all the way back in 1933-34, and very weirdly enough, it involved the Daily Mail. Yes, that Daily Mail. The newspaper that still exists today that you really shouldn't be using as a credible source of information. But anyway, that aside, back in 1934, the owner of the Daily Mail, a Lord Rothermere, harnessing a bit of his national British pride, wanted to see Britain produce a high-speed passenger plane, the fastest one in Europe, and maybe the fastest on the entire planet. Rothermere wanted something that would blow Britain's current stable of biplane aircraft out of the water, and he challenged all of the major aviation companies in Britain to make his desired plane a reality. The company that would step up to the challenge and have their proposal accepted was the Bristol Aeroplane Company. The year prior to Lord Rothermere's challenge, Bristol's chief designer, unrelated to Lord Rothermere, gone over to America to see firsthand their newest innovations on monoplane passenger aircraft, and from this experience he would design the Type 135, a twin-engine monoplane that was powered by 2 Bristol Aquila engines. This design was not accepted for further work by Bristol's own corporate board, but it was communicated to an employee of Rothermere, a Robert Lewis, and in this communication, the Aquila engines would be swapped out for 2 supercharged Bristol Mercuries, an older engine, but it was more available as the Aquila hadn't actually even been tested yet. With the new engine on this design, Bristol would project a top speed of 240 miles an hour, which was just under Rothermere's desire of 250 miles an hour. Once it was communicated to him, Rothermere was quite intrigued, and after some back and forth, ironing out design details, ironing out contract details, and there being some surprise opposition from some military higher-ups, a contract was signed in March 1934 for 1 aircraft, now named the Type 142. By April 12, 1935, Lord Rothermere's baby, which would receive the name of Britain First, was completed and would take to the air. Part of Rothermere's desire to make this aircraft was to show the British military that they were severely lagging behind in their aircraft technology and in their design philosophies, and not too long after its first flight, following a slight redesign of it, the Type 142 would display performance that was well and above the British military stable of biplanes, breaching the 300-mile-an-hour top speed barrier. This little stunt by Rothermere worked beautifully, and the design would draw significant interest from the British military, who wanted to use it as a high-speed bomber. For military purposes, the Type 142 would have to be altered a bit, to make room for a bombardier, the bombs, and some defensive weaponry, which would result in the following. The wings were moved from a low-set position to a mid-set position. The nose and cockpit were reconfigured. There would be the addition of two 7.7 mil turrets, one firing forward and one to the rear, and there would be the addition of a bomb bay that could hold upwards of 1,000 pounds of explosives. Whether it was because the British military was very confident in this redesign, or whether it was because Britain just wanted to rapidly arm themselves with something that was more modern, the Royal Air Force officially ordered 150 of them to be designated the Type 142M in September 1935, without having the redesign tested or flown. The RAF was basically now just taking Bristol's word for it, that the 142M design would be just fine. From this point, the 142M design would proceed down two effective paths, one that saw the first 142M be delivered and flown on June 25, 1936, and another that saw the use of the Type 142 design as the basis for a new design, to meet a requirement from the British Air Ministry for a new torpedo bomber. In the former case, with the Type 142M, by its first flight date receiving the name of Blenheim Mark I, it wasn't performing as well as it did before, which was expected due to the design alterations and the additional armor and reinforcement to the frame that was needed for a combat aircraft, and with a top speed of 281 miles an hour for a bomber in mid-1936, its performance was pretty solid. Its top speed was roughly on par with Germany's Bf-109 prototype, and with this pretty solid performance, the Blenheim would receive further orders from the RAF and would officially go into wider production, and by the end of the war, there would be over 4,400 of them made in total. But once the war actually started, the once very solid performance of the 1936-era Blenheim had been made mediocre in the face of the general evolution of aircraft tech in the meantime. Being so prominent in number, though, the Blenheim nevertheless played a prominent role early in the war, serving very often as frontline bombers and also as converted night fighters, and overall they were a glass cannon of sorts. They did decent enough damage as bombers and served relatively well as night fighters, but suffered significant losses on account of their poor defensive capabilities and ever more mediocre speed as time went on. Regardless, though, they were an important part of early World War II Britain. But now, going back to the other pathway for the Type 142 design, a year prior to that, the Air Ministry released a pair of new specifications, one for a twin-engine torpedo bomber, and the other for a reconnaissance aircraft. With Bristol already having the Type 142 in their possession, and it performing pretty well, they figured that its general design, if it was modified, would be pretty well suited for one or both of these roles, and to fit the said roles, the Type 150 was born. This short-lived design was effectively a modified Blenheim, with the cockpit moved forward by 1.4 meters, and the rear-facing defensive turret moved more towards the tail, which in turn would increase the space between the two crew members to give them the room for an additional third crew member, a radio operator. For the torpedo bombing role, a single 18-inch, 1,605-pound torpedo could be held underneath in a semi-recessed bomb bay, and due to the inevitable increase in weight from its new role, it was proposed that stronger engines, the Bristol Perseus, were to be installed. All of these modifications gave the Type 150 an overall more boxy appearance, which was necessary for the additional crew member. After submitting this design to the Air Ministry, Bristol would decide to further revamp this design, either in an effort to make it fit both of the prospective roles, or in an effort to make it better fit specifically the torpedo bomber role. A little bit of conflicting info on that one, but whatever the actual reason was here, the nose and cockpit was further extended forward, just by a couple inches this time, enough to make room for a fourth crew member, this time a navigator. This slightly different design would be given the new designation of Type 152. Very early in the Type 152's career, before any kind of construction was slated to begin, the Perseus engines were deemed to be not powerful enough, and the new Bristol Taurus engine was selected to replace it. While the Taurus was still very early in its development, it offered much greater power, and that power there was the primary concern. A contract was given to Bristol in August 1936 for 78 torpedo bombers, and despite the design's similarities to the Blenheim, and how you would expect production to be quite fast as a result, it took more than 2 years until the first Type 152 took to the air, a substantial delay that you can't imagine Bristol or the Air Ministry was actually anticipating. Partially, this delay was because of the new Taurus engine, as it was still in development and suffered early on from overheating issues. The other factor in this delay was the Blenheim, this time in part because Bristol was focusing more on its development and production, and in part because Britain, anticipating a future conflict, was reconfiguring their production facilities to make them more protected and less noticeable to potential down-the-line enemy aircraft that may be flying overhead. But by the time the Type 152, at this point given the name of Beaufort, took to the air on October 15, 1938, some international developments had already kickstarted the next in the familial line, a new fighter design using the Beaufort and the Blenheim as the basis. In the few weeks and months before the Beaufort's first flight, with Britain in the process of rearming and reconfiguring, some in the British military realized that their lack of a viable heavy or long-range fighter may end up being a bit of a detriment. As we've talked about many times here, heavy fighters were the new hotness that everybody wanted around this time, and if Britain was rearming, then they wanted some of that new hotness too. Adding to this need and/or desire, Germany's very clear military and territorial ambitions in Czechoslovakia, which were eventually acceded to in the Munich Agreement, further signaled to some in the military that the need for a new heavy fighter had increased substantially, and they needed it as quickly as possible. Several new heavy fighter designs were in the works, but significant delays and inevitable growing pains that they would experience effectively then necessitated a sort of stopgap design, one that wasn't necessarily great, but would at least do the job until more capable aircraft came along. So, with Bristol having already made the Blenheim, and with them working on the Beaufort, they began looking into how they could potentially use them in this heavy fighter endeavor. Obviously, just fitting something like the Beaufort with more guns was technically an option, but the Beaufort's larger cockpit and crew cabin would end up being a major detriment to performance for a fighter, and for a heavy fighter design, having 4 crew members was completely unnecessary. But for the rest of the Beaufort's design, or at least most of it, in the wings, the landing gear, and the tail section, all of those elements were considered to be pretty well suited for a new fighter design. Of course, some stronger engines and a heavier armament would be greatly appreciated, but the only major thing that would have to be new on the new design was the fuselage and cockpit. Because of the very likely ease of production here, drawing up a design for what was initially called the Type 156 took just a couple of days, and in October 1938, the same month as the first flight of the Beaufort, Bristol submitted their Type 156 design to the Air Ministry, and received an order of 4 prototypes shortly thereafter. Measuring in at 12.6 meters long, 17.63 meters wide, and 4.83 meters tall, the Type 156 shared the wingspan of the Beauforts, for obvious reasons, but it was slightly shorter lengthwise and slightly taller height-wise. Powered by a pair of Bristol Hercules 1 engines that were stronger than the Taurus, the estimated top speed was around 335 miles an hour, a solid if unspectacular speed. For the heavy fighter role, the Type 156 would need a pretty heavy armament, and for a pre-World War II aircraft, its proposed armament was indeed pretty heavy. 4 20mm cannons all concentrated in the nose. The armament would be positioned in such a way that the second crew member, who was also the navigator, would have direct access to the cannons to reload them. And as the second crew member was the navigator, he was given his own little tiny bubble-style canopy on the top of the fuselage just behind the wing. By November 1938, the Type 156, receiving the name of Beaufighter as a shortening of the more official name of Beaufort Fighter, they received the green light to officially proceed with mock-ups and prototype production. And by July 17, 1939, the first prototype Beaufighter would take to the air. In this initial form, lacking any kind of armament or combat equipment or ballast to simulate the weight of either of those, the prototype Beaufighter managed to reach 335 miles an hour. And as this early model had the Hercules 1 engine, it was assumed that installing the stronger Hercules 3 on the subsequent models would help offset the weight increase. However, on the third prototype, which was outfitted with combat gear and all that good stuff, the top speed would see a significant dip down to 309 miles an hour, and the horsepower boost from the Hercules 1 to the Hercules 3 wasn't viewed as being large enough to boost the top speed back to 335. This left the Beaufighter in a very strange spot. Other than that top speed, the prototypes perform pretty well, displaying decent enough handling and maneuverability for a heavy fighter, aside from some instability issues. So, since the Hercules 3 engine wouldn't be doing the trick, the Beaufighter needed a new engine, something a good bit stronger than the Hercules 1 or 3. In this need, the Beaufighter and Bristol went down 2 different paths again. The initial path was to use the Bristol Hercules, but they skipped the 4 and 5 model and wanted to go straight to the Hercules 6, a 2-speed supercharged version that boosted power to over 1,600 horsepower. However, these Mark 6 engines were in very short supply, and quite frankly, the Hercules in general was viewed as being in short supply due to other aircraft designs, which then led them down an alternate path. So while these early Beaufighter 1 or 1F models would be forced to use the Mark III engines or the very similar Mark 11 engines later on, the Beaufighter Mark II design would go away from radials entirely and went with an old friend in the Rolls-Royce Merlin, specifically the Merlin 20. Production of the early Beaufighter models was pretty rapid, as Britain was kind of desperate for heavier fighters in the early stages of the war, and Bristol received a contract in mid-1940 for nearly 1,000 Beaufighters, ideally to be equal numbers of both the 1 and 2 model. Very early in the full-scale production of it, after about 50 or so planes had rolled off the line, the design received a slight modification to hold an additional 6 .303 caliber machine guns in the wings. Weirdly, they were in an asymmetric configuration, with 2 in the left wing and 4 in the right. But this gave the Beaufighter a total armament of 10 forward-firing guns, making it very powerful for its time, and it was one of the most well-armed British fighters seen in the entirety of World War II. By the time the first production-run Beaufighters were being delivered in mid to late 1940, the fact that Germany was now on Britain's doorstep, that gave the Beaufighter a very clear hole to fill, in the role of a night fighter. As the Beaufighter was a larger twin-engine fighter, this made it very easy to fit early radar tech in the nose without sacrificing much in the way of performance, and with its 10-gun armament, it certainly wouldn't be having any trouble taking down enemy aircraft. Due to some delays in the radar tech, these early Beaufighters were occasionally not equipped with radar at all, or were equipped with more primitive and crappier radar. But still, Britain had something that could pretty well fit the night fighter role, despite the overall top speed performance of the Beaufighter not being great, at least compared to other fighter designs, and even though the control and maneuverability was just fine, the Beaufighter still proved to be quite valuable here in the latter stages of the Battle of Britain and beyond that. In addition to this night fighter role that it would serve not only in Europe, but around the world in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, over India, owing to its very solid gun armament and the larger size of its frame, the Beaufighter ended up being adapted to do basically anything. A ground attacker, a torpedo bomber that would serve alongside the Beaufort, a dive bomber, an anti-ship aircraft, you name it, the Beaufighter could probably do it. Early on, it didn't have racks on the underside for explosives, but its strong forward armament allowed it to nevertheless perform a ground attack role very well. And when it did have the racks installed, the addition of some bombs or some rockets further added to what was overall a pretty effective aircraft. Allegedly as well, over in the Pacific, the Japanese would give the Beaufighter the nickname of Whispering Death, due to the Hercules engines using sleeve valves that ran quieter than normal valves. Now, this technically may not have been true, but the nickname Whispering Death is fantastic, so I think I'm just going to choose to believe it. It's more fun that way. But for the Beaufighter's overall career, even as it was replaced in some of its roles later in the war through the introduction of higher power aircraft like the de Havilland Mosquito, it nevertheless was an incredibly important aircraft for the British in the Second World War, becoming one of their most destructive aircraft, with 70 pilots becoming aces with the Beaufighter, a feat that was made all the more impressive when you consider that most of its air-to-air combat was at night, where it's harder to see. Outside of night fighting, though, the Beaufighter took down several 100,000 tons of Axis shipping, along with dozens and dozens and dozens of trains and rail cars, and probably innumerable numbers of ground vehicles and various ground targets. Simply put, the Beaufighter was the more behind-the-scenes workhorse of the RAF and the Royal Navy. While planes like the Spitfire and Mosquito were getting all of the acclaim, the Beaufighter was there putting in the hours and doing work. And with its overall production run of almost 6,000, it did a lot of work. So overall, of the three aircraft discussed here, the Beaufighter was the sort of golden child of the group, the one that had the most produced, saw the most use, and was the most effective. But all three of these planes were pretty important in their own ways. The Blenheim, at the very least, gave Britain a relatively decent and more modern aircraft in the lead-up to and the early stages of World War II. It was outdated pretty quickly, but it did also spur the British military to modernize. Then the Beaufort, in its actual combat role, was a pretty solid torpedo bomber, but probably its better contribution was its parts being used to quickly make the Beaufighter, and give Britain a very versatile workhorse. This line of aircraft ended up being quite vital for Britain, and yet they do not receive the fanfare of other British aircraft. If the Spitfire and the Mosquito and the like were akin to the Porsche and Ferrari of British planes, then the Bristol line here was like the Toyota Camry. It wasn't the most appealing, it wasn't the best performing, but it was old reliable that got the job done. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, I'll be real here, I'm not a car guy. I know Porsche and Ferrari exist, but I can't really name specific models by them. To me, Porsche, they make the Porsche car, and Ferrari, they make the Ferrari car, and Lamborghini, they make the Lamborghini car. I mean, it's not like I'll ever own one of those cars anyway, so why do I need to learn the names of them? I know the Toyota Camry and the Honda Civic and stuff like that. That's more in my price range. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.